To understand what really just happened between the United States and Canada, you have to stop watching the podiums and press conferences and start looking at what's happening beneath our feet. You've seen the headlines and breaking alerts about tariffs, trade wars, and the aggressive rhetoric coming out of the Trump administration toward our northern neighbor. But that noise isn't where the real story is. If you haven't already, subscribe to the channel. Let me know where you're watching from in the comments and hit the like button to help this reach others who need to understand what's really happening. I'm Robert Rich, a professor of public policy at the University of California, Berkeley, and I've spent my career studying the intersection of economics, power, and democracy. Today, I want to break down what's really happening, who benefits, who pays the price, and how deeper economic forces are driving these outcomes. You've been sold a story of strength and tough negotiation. The idea that the United States can simply flex its muscles and force better terms from its partners. It's a narrative where one side shouts and the other side gives in. But when you look at the actual economic data and the immediate reaction in the commodities markets, a very different story emerges. This wasn't a display of leverage, it was a revelation of vulnerability. I want to walk you through why, because it exposes a fundamental truth about the global economy that politicians often ignore. Threats are not a substitute for strategy. When this administration threatened tariffs on Canadian potash, they weren't holding a gun to the Canadian economy. They were exposing their own dependence. They were pointing it directly at the American farmer and, by extension, the American consumer. To understand how severe this miscalculation was, you have to understand what potash actually is. This isn't a luxury good. It's not a flat screen TV or a piece of software you can skip when prices rise. Potash is potassium, and it's an essential nutrient for plant growth. Potash is the lifeblood of modern agriculture. Without it, crop yields collapse and food production falters. It's a biological necessity. Now consider where the United States gets this vital resource. American farmers rely on Canada for nearly 90% of their potash. Let that number sink in. This isn't a diversified supply chain you can simply switch if the price rises. It's near total dependency. So when the threat emerged to tax this import, it wasn't just a tariff. It was a threat to the very foundation of American agriculture. The markets recognized this immediately, even if political strategists didn't. The moment the president spoke, potash prices didn't wait for legislation. They surged instantly. This is the hidden story most mainstream coverage missed. While pundits debated political optics, the markets were already pricing in disaster. Fear is a powerful economic force, and the mere suggestion of a supply disruption sent prices skyrocketing. Who paid that price? Not Canadian mining companies. It was the farmer in Iowa, the grower in California, the producer in the Midwest suddenly staring at a balance sheet that no longer made sense. This was, in my view, an own goal of spectacular proportions. You have to ask yourself, why would a political administration target a supply line so critical to its own domestic stability? The answer lies in a fundamental misunderstanding of how structural power works in the 21st century. Some believe political rhetoric can override geological reality, but geology doesn't care about tweets or campaign promises. Canada controls the largest high-quality potash deposits in the world. That's a fact no amount of posturing can change. What we're seeing here is a collision between the illusion of political authority and the hard wall of economic reality. On the surface, it looked like the United States was tough on trade. In reality, it was exposing its own jugular. This is a textbook example of what happens when economic policy is driven by performative conflict rather than careful analysis of supply chains. We're seeing the consequences of treating trade relationships as zero-sum games, where for me to win, you must lose. In a deeply integrated global economy, and especially within North America, that kind of thinking is suicidal. You cannot blow up the bridge you're standing on and expect only the other side to fall. The immediate blow to the U.S. economy was self-inflicted. Attacks on American production carried out by an American administration, all in the name of protecting American interests. The irony here is striking. We often talk about the invisible hand of the market, but in this case, we saw the very visible hand of political incompetence. The Canadians didn't need to shout, issue counter threats, or engage in a public battle. They simply waited. The Canadians knew something the American administration apparently did not. In this sector, the United States needs Canada far more than Canada needs the United States. This is what structural leverage looks like: quiet, stable, and incredibly powerful. While the US was busy creating chaos and driving up costs for its own citizens, Canada was calmly strengthening trade relationships and preparing precise countermeasures. They understood that the leverage of essential resources far outweighs the noise of political bluster. And this episode is just a microcosm of a larger systemic failure. We've entered a period where economic statecraft has been replaced by economic bullying. But bullying only works when you actually hold the power. In the case of critical raw materials and essential resources, the power lies with the producer. By threatening Canada, the administration didn't show strength. It revealed a lack of basic economic literacy. It signaled to the world and to the markets that it doesn't understand the fragility of its own supply chains. This kind of volatility is poison for an economy. Farmers can't plan for the future when input costs can double overnight because of a political tantrum. Businesses can't invest when the rules of trade are being rewritten on a whim. The stability required for long-term economic growth was sacrificed for a short-term media cycle. I'm going to dig into who benefits from this kind of chaos because it certainly isn't you. It isn't the families scrambling to pay higher grocery bills as farming costs rise. It isn't the rural communities that depend on a stable agricultural sector. There are interests that thrive on this instability, and we need to identify them. But first, you must recognize that the official story of protecting American industry was false. You cannot protect American industry by cutting off its raw materials. You cannot make America wealthy by making its food production more expensive. The real disconnect is between the narrative of national self-sufficiency and the reality of global interdependence. We're often told that the US can stand alone, but the Potash crisis proved in just hours that we cannot. The system is linked. Borders may slow goods, but they can't stop prices. When you slap a tariff on a critical import, you're not punishing a foreign producer, you're punishing yourself. This raises the question, why employ this strategy at all? Was it sheer ignorance or a calculated distraction? Often in these scenarios, the noise is the point. The conflict is manufactured to create a sense of action. But in economics, action always has reaction. And the reaction here was immediate: a transfer of wealth from American farmers to speculative markets, and ultimately to the very foreign producers the policy aimed to target. The policy was supposed to discipline, but the outcome was perverse. You're being asked to cheer for a policy that makes you poorer, to support a strategy that weakens the very foundation of the national economy. This keeps happening because the true mechanics of trade disputes are rarely explained in plain English. You hear about billions in tariffs and assume the government is collecting from another country. That's not how it works. Those costs are paid by importers, which means American businesses and eventually you. The potash incident is a perfect case study. There's no substitute for fertilizer. You can't innovate your way out of a potassium deficiency in a single growing season. The demand is inelastic. No matter how high the price goes, farmers have to pay it or they go out of business. The administration effectively handed a loaded weapon to market speculators and said, "Go ahead, squeeze the American farmer." And they did. Prices surged not because of a shortage, but because of the threat of a shortage. This is the cost of uncertainty. This is the price of incompetence. And it's part of a broader pattern of using trade as a blunt instrument in a delicate system. The damage was done before the first tariff was even collected. The threat alone disrupted the market and punished the domestic economy. In the modern world, credibility and stability are currencies just as important as the dollar. When a government loses its reputation for rational behavior, it adds a risk premium to everything it touches, and you end up paying that premium. To understand why this happened, you have to look at the official story presented to the American public, which was designed to sound reasonable on the surface. The administration framed it as a matter of national pride and economic fairness. We were told that Canada was taking advantage of the United States and that threatening tariffs would simply even the playing field. The narrative claimed tariffs were a negotiation tool, and by issuing the threat, the United States would force Canada to concede on other trade issues, perhaps dairy, lumber, or automotive parts. The logic was transactional. It assumed that if you squeeze a country hard enough on one resource, they'll concede on everything else. It treats international trade like a real estate deal. The loudest voice gets the best price. We were meant to see this as a show of strength, a necessary measure to protect American interests. But this surface story completely ignores the specific economics of the fertilizer market. It assumes all commodities are interchangeable and all trading partners easily replaceable. In reality, this narrative wasn't just incomplete. It was dangerously misleading. When you talk about potash, you're not talking about a market with countless suppliers. You're talking about an oligopoly where a few key players control the vast majority of the global supply. Canada is the Saudi Arabia of potash. Canada sits on the largest and highest quality potash reserves in the world in Saskatchewan. The United States simply doesn't have the geological capacity to replace that supply. This isn't a matter of policy, investment, or will. It's geology. You can't legislate a mineral deposit into existence. So when the administration threatened to tax Canadian potash, they weren't threatening a replaceable competitor. They were threatening a monopoly supplier. They had no choice but to use. The misleading part of the official story was the idea that the US had leverage in this relationship. The United States is the dependent party, and pretending otherwise led the country into an economic ambush of its own making. We need to step back and look at the system behind this because it reveals how disconnected our political class has become from the physical realities of the economy. The global food system rests on a fragile web of inputs. We often focus on the price of bread or milk at the grocery store, but we rarely look at the industrial chain that makes that food possible. Potash is mined deep underground in massive capital-intensive operations. It takes years and billions of dollars to bring a new mine online. You can't just flip a switch and increase production because a politician is angry. Supply is rigid in the short term, and this rigidity is a key feature of the system. It means that when there's a shock or even the threat of one, prices don't adjust gradually. They spike violently. The system is designed for efficiency, not resilience against political volatility. By injecting chaos into this rigid system, the administration triggered a panic that market mechanisms couldn't absorb. The background context is crucial. For decades, the North American economy has been integrated to create a seamless flow of goods. This integration wasn't an accident. It was built to lower costs and increase efficiency for both sides. American farmers benefit from a stable, high-quality supply of fertilizer right next door, delivered by a reliable rail network. This is a structural advantage for U.S. agriculture, keeping input costs far lower than if we had to rely on shipments from Russia or Belarus. When you threaten to disrupt that integration, you're attacking your own structural advantage, breaking a system that works efficiently on purpose. The economic system rewards stability and predictability. When a government becomes an agent of instability, every business in the chain is forced to hoard cash and hedge against risk. This slows the velocity of money and drags down the entire economy. We also have to talk about inelastic demand because it's the economic force that punished the American farmer in this scenario. Inelastic demand means you need the product regardless of the price. If a vacation gets more expensive, you can stay home. If fertilizer gets more expensive, you can't stop fertilizing your crops without risking bankruptcy. The sellers know this. The markets know this. So when the tariff threat came, the market knew American farmers had no choice but to pay whatever price was demanded. The leverage the administration thought it had over Canada was an illusion. The real leverage lay in geology and market structure. The Canadians understood this perfectly. They didn't respond with anger. They responded with the calm confidence of someone holding the only key to a locked door. The Canadians knew that eventually the United States would have to back down or destroy its own agricultural sector. This raises a key question: who actually pays for these political theatrics? In the complex machinery of global trade, costs rarely land on those at the top. They're passed down the line until they hit the people with the least power to resist. In this case, costs flowed from speculators to distributors and finally to farmers. The Canadian mining companies didn't lower prices to absorb the tariff threat. Why would they? Have a product the world needs. Instead, the uncertainty premium was baked into the price paid by the American inducer. This is a classic example of how protectionist rhetoric often achieves the opposite of its stated goal. Rather than protecting the domestic economy, it exposed it to a price shock that drained capital from rural communities, a wealth transfer from the productive economy of the heartland to the speculative economy of trading floors. And we must also consider the geopolitical dimension. The United States has spent decades building a global order based on rules and trade agreements, are meant to provide a framework where disputes can be resolved without resorting to economic warfare. When the leading power in that system ignores the rules and relies on coercion, it weakens the entire structure. It signals to other nations that agreements are worthless and that only brute power matters. But as we saw with the Potash case, power is relative. You may have the largest military and economy, but if you don't have the potassium, you're still vulnerable. The Canadians demonstrated that structural power, control over essential resources, is far more durable than political power based on bluster. They leveraged their dominance quietly and effectively. No public spectacle was needed. The market made the point for them. Capitalism is often described as a free market, but in reality it's a system of power relations. The relationship between a monopoly supplier and a dependent buyer is not one of equals. It is one of structural dependency. The administration tried to pretend this dependency didn't exist, acting as if the United States could dictate terms to reality, but reality always wins. The Potash crisis was a harsh lesson in the limits of political will. You can't bully a supply chain you don't control. It exposed the arrogance of a worldview that treats trade as a battlefield rather than a network of mutual needs. While the headlines have moved on, the structural vulnerability revealed by this event remains. We're still dependent, we're still vulnerable, and as long as our leaders ignore the basic mechanics of the resources we rely on, we'll continue paying the price for their ignorance. This isn't just a story about fertilizer, it's a story about the hubris of power and the unforgiving nature of economic gravity, and it raises the most important question in political economy. Who benefits and who pays? When a policy like this is announced, the administration wants you to believe the foreign country pays, that the tariff is a bill sent to Ottawa, and somehow the Canadian government will write a check to the US Treasury. But that's not how tariffs work, especially with essential raw materials. The Canadian potash producers didn't pay for the threat. If anything, they likely benefited from the chaos. When the price of a global commodity spikes due to supply fears, those holding inventory see the value of their assets rise. It's a perverse outcome. The threat meant to punish the supplier actually strengthens their market power. The real winners were the speculators and trading houses that thrive on volatility. Stability is bad for speculation. Predictable prices make it hard to make a quick fortune. But when a government throws a hand grenade into a supply chain, the markets go wild, and traders who know how to ride the wave make millions while the real economy suffers. Who pays? The American farmer. Modern farming is a high-volume, razor-thin margin business. Farmers borrow money in the spring to buy seeds, fuel, and fertilizer, hoping the fall harvest will cover costs and leave a small margin to live on. It's a gamble with weather and global markets every single year. When the price of a primary input like potash surges, it doesn't just eat into profits, it threatens the very viability of the farm. It can wipe them out entirely. We're talking about family farms already operating on the edge of solvency. For them, a sudden 20–30% spike in fertilizer costs isn't an inconvenience, it's an existential threat. And they have no way to immediately pass that cost on because the price of corn or wheat is set by the global market, not the local grower. The farmer can't just tell the grain elevator to charge more because the president picked a fight with Canada. He has to absorb the loss.